stage 3 training on sharing your message in the public sphere. Is everyone able to see my screen? Thanks for the thumbs up and the nods. So this is a stage 3 training, meaning it falls under Learn to Advocate. So tonight we're talking about communication, not as like an initial group growing strategy or as kind of Instagram that you want to keep up in a stage 2 sense, but we're talking about communication as an advocacy tool for movement building and getting your message out there, growing your group, and kind of amplifying your voice in the community. Effective messaging should do two things. And it matters because it's really how people understand your work and where they join into it. The two things effective messaging should do is bring people into your work and amplify your power and message. So thinking about bringing people into your work, good communication in the public space helps people understand what the problem is that you're talking about, why it matters, and how they can participate. When messaging connects to people's values and experiences, it really helps them to see themselves as a part of the story that you're telling and the vision that you're casting for your community. The second is that it amplifies your power and your message if you are communicating effectively in the public arena, so to speak. So when your message spreads through the community, especially through public spaces and media, it can make your group louder. What I mean by that is amplification of your message through effective messaging can increase awareness about the issue, attract new supporters, and add pressure to decision makers to act. So strong stage 3, stage 4 local conversations are thinking strategically about how their messaging is inviting people into the work, clearly communicating what your group is and what you're seeking to accomplish, and really connecting emotionally too with people in the community. I'm going to use an example from Strongtown Santa Barbara just because I had a delightful conversation with them this afternoon. We talked a lot about strategic communication. So they're in a conversation right now with their local government and with other community groups about keeping their downtown State Street car-free. And there are dozens of different groups in the community and a majority of council members who are all for this. But the mayor and a very vocal downtown property owner group are pretty against it. And so the city and the kind of general space in their community right now is trying, and I don't know how intentional this is, but they're trying to put the local conversation, Strongtown Santa Barbara, into this kind of box where they're the voice of the project. And in reality, it was the city's own charrette in 2020 that like pointed out that this was a great idea. The local conversation is just running with like this idea that's endorsed by all of these other groups, so on and so forth. So Strongtown Santa Barbara is thinking really strategically about their communication, about what they're doing, what they're bringing to the table, who they're representing, so that they're really intentionally not stepping into this us versus them trap that's kind of been set for them in this particular fight. And they're clear that they want to be amplifying their message of a vision for State Street that's a public living room that's car-free, where kids are playing, where businesses are thriving, and that their goal is to come out of this fight having won that, yes, and having kind of brought people in rather than drawing lines that keep an us versus them mentality. So let's talk through these kind of two goals of bringing people in and amplifying your message. Goal 1, bring people in. Good communication really brings people, like I said, into the table, helps them understand the problem, helps them care about the issue, and helps them see a role for themselves in solving it. The example for connecting people's stories and kind of connecting them personally to the issue that I love. I've worked with a lot of folks who have aging parents who really want to stay in their home, want to stay in their neighborhood, but are really struggling to do that. They can't drive to where they need to go anymore. They can't keep up their big house. They can't afford to stay in the neighborhood that they grew up in, raised their kids in, and have lived in for decades. This is an incremental development story in a lot of ways. And I think as strong towns advocates, it's really easy to see, oh, this is an incremental development story, right? Backyard cottages would really fit this story beautifully. Um, Listening to our neighbors and making that connection with them, that, oh, this is not a your family unique story of what it's like to age in our city. This is a story about development and you're a part of it and here's how. That connection is really powerful work. Good communication that brings people in also connects around shared values. So people respond to messaging about things that they identify with, whether that's a particular neighborhood in town or a house of worship that they're a part of, or a value that they see themselves as having and living out. This can look many, many different ways. It can look like, somebody seeing themselves as a great parent who wants the best for their kids. Okay, this is a really deep-seated value, and that's so much more impactful to bring someone in on than simply having watched Not Just Bikes, which is an entry point for many of us. But if we can get to that deeper level of like, why did those resonate with you? Oh, I have two kids. I want to be a great parent. Okay, that's the deeper value there. And then wanting to be a part of making their town stronger, whatever that looks like. Like my own example, I want a walkable neighborhood for my city. I have dreams of being able to just like walk to a store, buy the two things I'm missing to make dinner, and walk home. And that's a vision that I'm willing to fight for. That's a value of what I want my community to look like. So connecting on kind of a clear sense of shared values, whatever that is, leaving something better for the next generation, leaving a legacy there. We could spend the whole time on different values that we could all overlap on with strong child's issues. Good communication that brings people in also highlights a really real problem. So people pay attention when they recognize something from their own experience, right? Something that they have felt, something that they have noticed. So for example, when I was working and living in Lexington, Kentucky, I had many, many, many conversations with change makers and elders in the community over the years who talked a lot about growing up in the same neighborhood, and on their street, they played outside in the street while their parents and grandparents sat on the porch and gossiped. And that was like that was an important part of their childhood, was that them and their friends who lived down the street were always playing in the road while the grown-ups and the adults sat on their porches together. And they contrast that, many people who share this sort of story, with today, they don't know their neighbors, their grandkids never play outside, so on and so forth. And there's a sense of loss there. As strong towns advocates, like Strodes are such a huge part of that story. Strodes are not everything that has happened in that story, but Strodes are a huge part of it. And so when we talk about Strodes in our community, highlighting the real kind of problem of kids can't play in our neighborhood anymore because the cars are going too fast, it's dangerous. Having that salient example, and one that people really relate to, like that's a real problem to them yesterday and today and tomorrow, can be really powerful in bringing people in our messaging. And then lastly, good communication that brings people in points people towards action. People want to know like what's happening, why does it matter, and then what can we do about it? It's really easy to feel powerless in our communities. And local conversations are a place where people can make a real and measurable impact and can grow their community. And that's really powerful. That's really hopeful work. And so good communication points people towards that next action step, whether it's come to this meeting, make this public comment, come join our social, whatever that next step is, it points people towards action. Then the second goal of good communication in the public sphere is amplifying your voice, amplifying your power. So messaging can also help make your work more visible and more influential. When a message spreads beyond your immediate group and beyond kind of what you're putting out, it can bring more attention to the issue. It can signal that people in the community or more people in the community really care about it. And it can really increase pressure on decision makers to respond. So effective public communication helps your group's voice carry further and louder than it could through just your channels or just individual conversations, just your local conversation. As an example, I was a part of a coalition in 2021, 2022 that was working to address rising gun violence in my community. We held an action. We had over 1,000 people come together to talk about it with local decision makers. The mayor chose not to attend. Part of our messaging was sharing that the mayor had chosen not to attend. And so when local news outlets picked this story up, front page of the newspaper was like, community advocates gather to address crisis in our community, mayor refuses to attend. The next week we had a meeting with the mayor. That amplification of the power that we had in the room, the 1,000 people, the message that we were sharing happened because the media and local news outlets kind of amplified that voice really beautifully. So thinking about kind of those two pieces, amplifying your power and voice, bringing people in, across the board, let's talk some principles of effective messaging. There's 4 today. We can kind of work on additional ones and addendums and all sorts of things, but I'm going to stick with these 4 as the kind of top ones. What's heard is more important than what is said. And I'll go through each of these individually as well. The messenger is often more important than the message. Emotion is generally more important than data and logic. And brevity beats precision every time. Let's go kind of beat by beat on this. So what is heard trumps what is said. The language I just used there, going, what is heard trumps what is said, makes many of us in the room think about the current national administration, right? Come back to me to local action. This is an example of the messaging totally not hitting the mark that it needs to hit, right? The point stays the same, whether I say what is heard trumps what is said, or what is heard is more important than what is said, what is heard beats what is said, but the word choice changes how many people are going to hear it. So effective communication, especially effective public communication, is really judged by how the audience interprets it, not at all by how the speaker intended it. And if people misunderstand your message, that's an opportunity to iterate and adjust the messaging. So as you're thinking about your local conversations message, think about what are people repeating back, what are they remembering, and what are they misunderstanding. Messaging improves when leaders really focus on what people are actually hearing and taking home with them versus what it was that you actually said. I think there's a lot of good examples across local conversations of what is heard being quite different actually than what was said. My go-to example today is with Albuquerque, who's been, as many of you know, in a big kind of zoning tense situation in their town. And their housing work was accused of being funded by big developers, by being funded by the Koch brothers, by being all sorts of things that were just not true in any way, shape, or form, but that the message was able to be co-opted a little bit. And the message was able to be heard in ways that were totally not accurate to the work that Strong Towns Albuquerque was doing. And they iterated on their messaging and they grew and they learned a lot from that. So what is heard more important than what is said? Second principle of effective messaging, the messenger is more important than the message. So people evaluate information through really the trust and the credibility of who they heard it from. And the same message will land very, very differently depending on who is delivering it. So the most powerful messaging comes from somebody who's trusted in the community, directly connected to the issue, and often able to speak from lived experience. And when people hear someone say, this matters to me because it affects my neighborhood, this matters to us because it affects our block, they listen differently than when somebody comes in as an abstract expert to speak. I know that we all have different personal examples of this. Maybe you tell a family member a million times that like this new restaurant down the street is really great and they would love it and they should check it out. And they're like, nah, it doesn't sound that good. But then their neighbor invites them 2 months later and they're sending you pictures like, hey, you got to check out this great new restaurant. It's so good. And you're like, I've been saying this all along. But like the messenger was really a whole lot more important than the message. You could talk about like how great the tamales were all day long, but they were only going to hear it from their neighbor. Um, Another example as an organizer, again in Kentucky, I worked on an accessible transportation campaign. And most of our elected council members who had worked with us on other issues were just, it felt like they just weren't getting it. Like they just weren't getting the urgency of this issue. Until we had a public meeting and one of our members stood up and shared his personal story. He was an avid cyclist. He was hit while cycling. He had to relearn how to walk and talk and struggled with all sorts of medical issues kind of after this accident. And so he talked about accessible public transportation as the only way he was able to interact with the community after having been like a business owner and an avid cyclist and a huge part of the community before his accident. One council member heard this and really resonated. He was an avid cyclist himself. He saw himself in this young man who shared his story, and he became like an immediate overnight champion for the accessible transportation campaign. Right? Like the messaging that we had been putting out didn't change at all. What changed was the person who was sharing the messaging, and that made a huge difference. So as you think about public message sharing for your local conversation, think about how many messengers you can have talking about the same thing. And this can look like, you know, if you have a young mom who always speaks at council about safe and productive streets, see if you can add a retiree to be the next public comment to talk about their experience. If you've got, you know, your most prolific social media star on your local conversation team who grew up on the south side of town, is there somebody from east side who can chime in and share their experience, right? And it's the same message, but by having different messengers, different people in your community are able to actually hear what it is that your message is and what you're sharing. Next principle, emotion beats logic. So people very rarely act because they heard a really great technical explanation of the problem. They act because they feel something. There's a connection there. Effective messaging connects things like pride in your neighborhood, concern about the future, frustration or feeling powerlessness with a kind of persistent problem that you've got in your neighborhood, and hope really that there's some solution or improvement or connection that's possible. Stories are really the most powerful tool for creating that sort of emotional connection to the work. As a bad example, if I were to get really into parking mandates in my community, I could talk about how parking mandates make our cities financially fragile. We need less free parking. We can talk about like for every $1,000 in building costs, it's $100 in rent, and parking spaces cost in the tens of thousands, and parking mandates create da 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 da. And most people are going to get lost really quickly in that list of numbers. Making it more personal, though, means that people are carrying that home with them and thinking about it and maybe getting more involved in the future, right? It's a whole lot more compelling to say, like, everyday people are struggling to pay their rent. I know that's something that I'm struggling with. Maybe that's something that you're struggling with. In my hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, 1 in 5 families can't afford their rent. So every month they're deciding, am I paying my rent or am I feeding my kids? Am I buying my medicine? Am I getting needed school supplies? So on and so forth. Having parking mandates mean that in a lot of ways, instead of building the homes that our community needs, we're literally just building more parking spaces for cars that we don't have. That has a whole lot less numbers, and that's a whole lot more emotionally resonant than like $1,000 in building costs is $100 in rent, so on and so forth. Um, Starting with the emotional story of it all is going to beat out the logic every time in terms of effective communication. And then lastly, brevity is more important than precision. So strong messages are short, they're clear, and they're memorable. A technically perfect explanation is less effective most of the time than a simple message that people can quickly understand and repeat. So organizing messages should be really easy to say, easy to remember, easy to share with others. Again, if we go back to the parking example, we could give all sorts of details about ending parking mandates, where we talk about, hundreds of cities like Seattle, like Buffalo are doing this. We can talk about, all sorts of different parking reform network history. We could talk about citations from Shoup. We could talk about, all sorts of different details. And those are important. But in terms of sharing our message publicly, again, something that's really brief is going to be a whole lot more impactful than something that is technically a whole lot more precise, but takes people a while to get through. So those are 4 top principles of effective messaging in the public sphere. Let's talk how to kind of get there as a group. Coordinating your public message. So when a group is communicating publicly, it really helps to be intentional about that coordination of messaging. Strong groups, especially as you get into like legislative fights, or if you're working on big projects that involve different collaborators, local government, it can be helpful to collectively agree on a few core messages, such as like, what problem are we talking about right now? Why the issue matters locally, what kind of change the group wants to see, and having a really clear and precise kind of bullet points for those things. Shared messaging helps communication be clear and consistent and recognizable. And coordination within your group helps prevent situations where different members are unintentionally, usually, communicating different priorities or different messaging. So having kind of coordinated messaging on specific campaigns is a really huge strength in public communication. Part of that is really helpful is designating a couple spokespeople for a particular public comment, a particular issue, a particular meeting with council members, a particular event. This helps to keep messaging consistent, have communication reflect the group's values and priorities. And it also helps reporters and community members know who to contact, who would be the right person to follow up with if they want to amplify this story, or you want them to amplify this story and want to make their jobs a little easier. Spokespeople are most effective when the message, again, has been collectively agreed upon. Because as a spokesperson for your local conversation, often people are speaking not as an individual, but on behalf of the entire group. And you should have many, many spokespeople for different things, right? It's not like you're this spokesperson for this event and nobody else gets to talk. No, it's about making sure that people feel as though their role is one where the group is supporting them in making public comment and meeting with the mayor in whatever it is. It's helpful to have like public comment workshops so that people can feel like, yep, I've got the talking points I need. I know I'm staying on messaging as I go to write my public comment, or collective decisions as to who's going to lead this meeting with the mayor, so on and so forth. The picture is from Blono. This is a fundraising dinner that they did. And Noah is a fantastic spokesperson, as you all know, for Blono. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about working with local media. So local media can really make your group louder by, again, amplifying your message. This can kind of add power behind the work that you're already doing. And media attention can be a powerful tool for creating pressure on decision makers who often are responding to issues that have a lot of public attention. You can grow the level of public attention through working effectively with local media. Journalists are looking for usually a clear local issue, real people affected by the problem, a personal story to tell, a timely event, a timely development, something that's coming up that means like an excuse almost for why they're running this story now. And then a simple explanation of why it matters. So my tips for reaching out to reporters, if you've got an issue that you want amplified, is to provide a really concise explanation of the issue, to give a really clear local angle, and then to have a really neat kind of rundown of the spokespeople or spokesperson who's available to talk about it. I'd also say you can start and continue building relationships with journalists and local media before, during, and after you have an event that's kind of worth putting a lot of time and energy into amplifying. And so if you are doing a bus bench build or a park cleanup or something else that's a little bit maybe more of a community building activity, more about building momentum in your group and getting people out there and growing community support and pride, and maybe isn't like a huge journal story, using that as an opportunity to connect with local media means that there's relationships for you to keep building on and drawing from down the line as well. And those sorts of stories of building bus benches, depending on the community that you're in, can be really interesting, really powerful stories for journalists and local news outlets that aren't things that they're seeing every day. So, bottom line on top, messaging is really a strategic choice. Every message that your group sends is answering questions for those in your community about what your group's about, why your work matters, is it something that they should care about, and who all in the community is fighting for this. It helps people understand the problem, feel connected, and really see a path towards action. You can also use effective messaging, again, to amplify your voice in the community. So let's start the discussion there, see where it goes. And I'm happy to go back to slides or take us in a completely different direction as well.